All right, we'll go ahead and get started here. Thank you again, everybody, for taking the time out of your busy day to meet with the team here at Lerch Bates and Reserve Advisors. We greatly appreciate the opportunity to meet with you. Now, today we have a great presentation from both firms on the topic of maintenance matters. So we're going to go over a couple of case studies, one on building enclosure systems, and then we're going to pivot over to modernization of vertical transportation equipment, what you would know as an elevator. And then we're going to go over some of the things that some of the reserve study standards. So CAI recently made some changes to the reserve study standards with support and guidance from many of the industry professionals that serve community associations. So with that, I'll go ahead here and turn it over to Yanni.
Hi there. So I am Yanni Hoffman. I'm a Vice President of Market Development with Lerch Bates. I've spent about 20 years with one of the elevator OEMs and then had the opportunity to join Lerch Bates. But I also want to point out that I am a condo owner. So we'll talk a little more about that when we get into the elevator part of the discussion.
Thank you for joining us today. My couple sentence bio is that I joined Reserve Advisors in 1999, and to this day, I still very much enjoy visiting a property like yours. I'm a licensed professional engineer in several states, including several that I see a lot of attendees from today. So welcome. I'm glad you guys are here.
And good morning, everybody from Denver, Colorado. I'm Jack Thewitt. I'm an area sales director with Lerch Bates, and I've been in the industry about 13 years now. At least 10 of those have been with Lerch Bates Building Enclosure Division, where I've had the opportunity to support both our new construction industries and helping deliver high quality building enclosures to the market, but also in our existing building industries, where I've had the privilege of working with many associations across the central region of the country, including some of those that are on the call today, I believe. So thank you very much for joining us. Today, I'm going to get a chance to cover a building enclosure case study. But before I jump into that, I'd like to talk just a little bit about what Lerch Bates does as a whole. So we are a professional services firm, meaning we have a national team of consultants and engineers that specialize in various systems within the building. So we work inside your building with elevators and escalators that Yanni will speak to in a minute. And then we also work outside the building with our building enclosure system. So everything from below grade waterproofing to plaza decks to parking decks, facade systems, windows, roofs, and also facade access equipment. So helping communities understand how you get to and maintain each of those systems. Lastly, we work with logistics, materials management inside the building. So loading dock design, waste management, things of that nature. But for today, I'm going to focus my remarks on what happens when maintenance is neglected with the building enclosure systems. And so to start, I think it's important to understand the various functions that our building enclosure serves. I think, we all know that it helps keep occupants comfortable inside the building. We know that it offers thermal performance and energy efficiencies. It obviously offers some aesthetic characteristics, so curb appeal, things like that, keep things looking nice. But one of the primary functions is that it protects the structure itself from prolonged exposure to water intrusion and degradation as a result of that. And so it's for that last function that I've chosen to look at a parking garage as our case study today to illustrate what happens when maintenance is not addressed timely and decisions are made that maybe were a bit misguided in hindsight. And so I've picked a parking garage, and now I will say this is a rather large parking garage that we're working on in the upper Midwest. It serves a large resort and community in the Iowa region. And what's happened is they're starting to see concrete failure due to prolonged water intrusion. So these are some pictures that were taken just a month ago along the left-hand side there. And you can see how there's a deflection, a bowing downward of those flange areas, essentially the concrete members spanning beams. That's resulted from that prolonged exposure to water intrusion, the corrosion of steel within that, and then the spalling of concrete that results of that. And so, I want to compare maybe that left photo to the diagram along the top right and illustrate the condition where we are today. So we're starting to see minimal failures of the concrete beneath the topping slab. But as these conditions progress, it's very likely that we will have a full depth failure of these flange conditions that presents obviously a life safety hazard to the occupants of the parking garage. And that is illustrated in the center on the small photos, what that looks like in the real world, but also along the bottom right there in the diagram, where you can see that a load applied from a heavy vehicle, think an F-350 driving over your parking garage, will ultimately cause full depth failure of this topping slab. And so obviously that's a concern, but we did not get here overnight. These things take a very long time to manifest. And so what we're going to cover today is really that manifestation over the last 10 years. And then we'll dig into the costs and the decisions made along the way to understand, how they performed the maintenance at the right time. The overall cost to the owner would have been substantially less than the cost that we're looking at today. So approximately 10 years ago, this ownership group started noticing signs of the traffic coating failing. So think bubbling, think chipping away of that traffic coating. And it's, comparable to look at this traffic coating like you would the roof of your structure. It certainly offers a nice aesthetic for parking garages, but it ultimately serves as a waterproofing membrane to keep the rain and the snow out of the parking structure itself. So in 2013, facility management noticed this and in good practice had requested funding for replacing this traffic coating system before it became a problem. Unfortunately, at the time, that funding was denied. And a few years later, they started to notice the signs of water intrusion and staining inside the garage beneath the top parking deck. So, this is the early indication that we're getting steel corrosion inside the concrete, that there's a chemical reaction occurring there. And what happens when steel begins to rust and corrode is that it actually expands. And when it expands, it spalls the concrete, presents a falling hazard, an overhead hazard to the occupants in the vehicles beneath. And so, the very next year, in about 2016, they finally authorized the originally requested funding for the traffic coating replacement. Unfortunately, that funding now needed to be utilized to chip out some concrete that had started spalling, and to really address the safety hazard that had been created because of this deferred maintenance issue that was not addressed a few years back. And that actually occurred one more time between 2016 and now, where a comparable amount of money had to be spent to address this safety hazard versus addressing the root cause of the issue, which, as we know, was the traffic coating system and the prolonged water intrusion that they were seeing. And so now, if we look at where we're at in 2023, it's a systemic structural concern on this top parking deck that requires significant repairs. And there's a very real conversation happening about, is it worth spending money to repair the system, or should we go ahead and replace this parking garage with the understanding that, we're going to get a brand new structure that's got a 50-year life expectancy or more? And the owner has decided that that's the route they're going to go. We have not yet funded the project, but they are very likely moving towards a brand new parking garage. And so you think about the cost implication of a coating 10 years ago versus a brand new structure today. And again, this is a very real example of a project that we're working on. So let's dig into the costs here. And this is a pretty dramatic example. Note that this is not typical. But it is real. And so in 2013, they had requested $200,000 to replace that traffic coating system on the top deck. And as we know, that funding was denied up until 2016, where it was authorized and subsequently utilized for the concrete repairs. But at the time, in 2016, they really needed $450,000 to replace both the traffic coating system and to perform those concrete repairs that were needed within the garage. So your accumulated expense to date, really that light green bar there, is now at $200,000. Fast forward to 2020, you can see the costs of the maintenance are growing substantially, but the overall spend was held relatively flat. Now we're investing $250,000 in concrete repairs. again, still not addressing the primary issue and cause, which was the traffic coding on the top. So accumulated spend at 450. And now, as we're looking at, this systemic failure and this life safety concern that has caused us to go ahead and close off that top deck of the parking garage, caused significant disruption to the occupants, and a huge cost burden of close to $6.5 million that they will need to fund in order to address this condition. I'll say from experience that these are not the kind of conversations we enjoy having with our clients. We'd much rather be proactive in helping put together plans, address maintenance timely, and avoid these issues that happen when you don't provide adequate waterproofing for your structures. But unfortunately, that's not always the case due to reasons outside of our control. So I noted that this is a presentation, a case study, if you will, on building enclosure systems. And I know many of you are thinking about your building enclosure as, your roof, your walls, your below grade if you have it. And so those conditions get quite a bit more complex. And so I'll share just a couple of photos with you here to illustrate what that looks like in the facade, balcony, and roofing systems. As you can see, the structural degradation is very prominent due to prolonged water intrusion. The facade systems and the repairs that have to happen when this occurs are very, very intrusive. I'd like to point out the photo in the middle is somebody's balcony, right? So there's a balcony door that leads into a living room in their home. And here you've got scaffolding up, crews outside that are starting at 7:30 in the morning. And so highly intrusive, but also very, very expensive in comparison to performing the maintenance activities at the right time. And so what I'd like to encourage folks to do is just make sure you have a plan in place. Make sure that as you're working with reserve advisors or your reserve partner, that you understand those capital expenditures, what they mean, and you're engaging professionals to help ensure you're spending that money timely and wisely. And so if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them in the chat. I believe Matt will be monitoring the chat here closely. Or you can scan that QR code, click on my email. I'd be happy to address any questions you may have related to building enclosure systems. So in the meantime, I'm going to hand it over to one of my favorite colleagues in Yanni Hoffman to touch on our vertical transportation systems.
Thanks, Jack. So I am Yanni Hoffman. As I mentioned, I got my start in the elevator industry about 25 years ago. And after spending about 20 years with one of the major OEMs, I had the opportunity to change hats. And now, as I like to tell my clients, I get to use my powers for good. And also, my husband and I own a condo. So that's given me an even better understanding of what being a part of an HOA means. I get that budgeting accurately is even more important for a multi-owner building than maybe another type of commercial property. When there's a miss, it's not just another budget to shuffle from. I have to write a check. My husband is also on our HOA board, so we get to see firsthand the impact on board members and why having all of the information to share with your neighbors is so vital to avoid contentious meetings or unplanned special assessments. So elevators, obviously a continuous point of frustration for many. What can you do to improve them? Well, first, I'm going to start with the bad news. When it comes to upgrading, under the best of circumstances, it's going to be expensive, it's going to take a long time, and it's going to be painful. So our job is to help you spend the right money at the right time for the right scope of work. And Jack, you might go ahead and advance that slide. So with elevators, 20 years ago, the typical life expectancy was, 35, 40 years. That's become more like 20 or 25 years. And last month I was at the test tower for one of the OEMs, and we were looking at their newest equipment they're getting ready to release. And they were telling us that this is now being built with a 15-year expected life cycle. So with that in mind, how do you approach this? I would say, first of all, it's making sure you're getting good preventative maintenance. Contractors like to be very vague in the commitments they make regarding service. And they also do everything possible to push costs back to you. If your maintenance contract has an elevator company's logo on the first page, you want to take a look at that. You want to check things like the indemnification language. You might find that it says you're actually indemnifying them rather than the other way around. So maintenance is certainly something we can help with, but the bigger point of the discussion today is about how to best address a modernization when the time comes. So a mod usually starts one of two ways. The contractors tell you that you need to plan for it and they give you a proposal, or you start having issue after issue and it gets to a point where it's obvious and overdue. If you get a proposal from a contractor, there are a couple things to keep in mind. It is absolutely in their best interest to get you to spend this money early and often. It reduces their costs to maintain the equipment. What you may not be told is that their price is often only the price for the elevator portion and not the rest of the scope that may come into play. Because when you modernize, not only does the elevator system have to meet current code, sometimes always the rest of the building equipment has to also come up to current code. And sometimes that's simple, inexpensive stuff like a GFCI in the pit or a new ladder. But sometimes it's a zone in the fire protection system or a generator interface where now you're adding tens of thousands of dollars in unplanned costs to the job. So also, you may or may not be getting a proposal to fully reset or upgrade the unit. At our condo, recently, we got a proposal to put on a new controller. Great, but there's no door work involved. And since, 2/3 to 3/4 of elevator issues are typically door related, sure seems like a miss to not update that while you're doing the other work. And sometimes this game is played in reverse. You'll get a proposal just to upgrade the doors. What happens then is you've spent money on a component that will likely be replaced when you do a full modernization, or it's a proprietary piece of equipment that now locks you into only one provider option when it comes to doing the rest of the project. We typically find that piecemealing a modernization will add 50 to 100% to the total overall cost. Now, you may get to spread that cost out over a few years, and there absolutely can be merit to that. But if it's approached as a phased project rather than individual steps, you can maybe close the gap on that extra spend. For example, I was just working with a property in Texas where a contractor did exactly this. They gave them a proposal for about $100,000 for door work on 4 elevators. When I talked to the property team, they said, yeah, we're just going to do that this year. And then we're going to look at a new machine and maybe controller and buttons in another couple of years. So I walked them through the challenges with this approach. And, in addition to all the other stuff I've explained, in the elevator world, the typical markup on a repair, which is doors, machines, buttons, anything short of a machine, or anything short of the controller, is typically triple the markup of a modernization. And then if you're doing a modernization and you're changing out the hoisting machine, it's pictured there in on the slide, the contractor may actually provide a deduct to use their gearless equipment, which is also typically more energy efficient. So switching approaches actually got them a far more comprehensive scope of work for less money than they had allocated to spend over the next 5 years. And they were able to compete this one time and not only get the best price for the upgrades, but they got the best price for the new maintenance contract too. The other thing that we frequently see is where equipment is well past its useful life. And then what happens is you start spending good money after bad. I've been working with a lady in Eastern Georgia, and they have 3 elevators that were installed in 1976. One of the units quit working. Not surprising, it was determined that the board that had gone bad was no longer available for purchase, so the only way to fix it was to repair that board. They did that. Okay? Then another issue came up that was kind of similar, and another. And after a while, they'd spent nearly $80,000 repairing boards. No new components, just repairing the existing. So something else to keep in mind in your elevator maintenance contracts is that nearly all elevator OEM paper says that if something is obsolete or no longer readily available, it's no longer covered. So even though you have a full maintenance contract, you're going to get a bill for that work. So back to the Georgia property. So after spending that $80,000, then they decided that actually maybe the problem was not the equipment, it was the maintenance provider. So they changed companies. The new company said, sure, no problem, just do this, do that, and you'll be able to get the units running again. So the property finally did that. They spent hundreds of thousands of dollars. But what they didn't understand is that it was just a Band-Aid. It was a temporary solution to keep the units running. Now they're asking us to help unravel a really unfortunate situation. And the lead times for new equipment currently are 8 to 10 months. So they're continuing to have to spend money on efforts to keep this equipment running that has absolutely no long-term value. If they had planned for this capital spend in a more timely manner, they could have saved so much time, money, and frustration. So my comment about spending the right money at the right time for the right scope, it's just critical. In a perfect world, somebody like Lerch Bates is in your building every 5 years or so to help review the maintenance. Make sure you are getting everything you're paying for. We can provide much more in-depth maintenance support, but a maintenance audit in and of itself will tell you a lot, and it will provide some capital spend guidance. Then as the time gets closer to upgrading, we can actually write that full scope of work, help you compete it. Keep in mind, we speak elevator. We can parse the value engineering efforts to at least make you aware of the options and impacts so that you can make a well-informed decision on how you approach that spend. And then we can also support you when it comes time to presenting that plan and answering questions within the wider community. So like Jack said, if you have any questions or specifics, you feel free to scan the QR code, or you've got my email address right there. So I'll hand it over to Todd.
Thank you, Yanni, and well done.
Thanks.
Conditions involving water infiltration or conditions involving accelerated deterioration, such as that first case study that Jack went through, they highlight the need for timely preventative maintenance, or they need to conduct repairs prior to conditions becoming critical or prior to becoming a major problem. So in response, a CAI task force revised the National Reserve Safe standards with an emphasis on building safety, with an emphasis on that preventative maintenance and making sure that that gets addressed. The Foundation for Community Association Research and CAI recently published these resources. As Matt mentioned earlier, we will provide everyone these slides, including clickable links to both of these resources upon completion of this webinar. CAI recognized that preventative maintenance, timely preventative maintenance, combined with a properly executed reserve study, can lead to a safe, desirable, and financially secure community. I heard the saying the other day that I really like that stated that financial integrity leads to structural integrity. Meaning if you have a financial game plan in place to take on your projects in a timely manner, including your preventative maintenance, that you're able to keep up and maintain the structural integrity of your components. The first document, the Best Practices Report on Maintenance, is a guide on how to develop and maintain a preventative maintenance manual. That second document that we'll provide the link to includes revisions to incorporate maintenance and structural integrity into your reserve studies. And the overall theme for our discussion here today is to minimize life cycle costs. And what made this presentation a little challenging was that the people on this webinar come from a wide variety of communities, and they have to maintain a wide variety of components. From maybe roads are your most important component, maybe pool is your most important component. Some for high rises, some from townhomes. We can only pick a couple. We pick building enclosure systems, concrete garage systems, and elevators. But the concept here, regardless of which discussion we're in, is to minimize life cycle costs. In other words, to repair small cracks before they become large cracks and cost way more to fix. This is trying to get in the mindset of a much more proactive approach to maintenance, as opposed to simply reacting to major issues. When we conduct reserve study inspections for high rises, for really any property with a significant amount of facade, we'll ask, what's the history of repairs? And we'll quite often get that history of repairs comprises chasing down leaks. In other words, reacting to leaks, fixing the leaks whenever they come up. But again, this concept is more proactive, a systematic preventative maintenance, taking on the small issues before they result into leaks in the units. Part of these new standards require reserve study providers to disclose whether a preventative maintenance program is in place and being used. We also have to account for the lack of preventative maintenance and how it impacts those remaining useful lives, which I'll talk about here in a minute. There are a lot of large preventative maintenance projects that should be included as reserve expenditures. If you have a significant amount of masonry, you have to do a significant amount of preventative maintenance on your masonry. That's certainly a reserve expenditure. But there are also those other smaller preventative maintenance projects that could be funded through your annual operating budget. And your reserve study provider will help guide you through reserves versus operating budget, which is the better method to funding method to use. Reserve studies should include recommended preventative maintenance. That preventative maintenance could be within their reports. In other words, if it's part of their narratives for each component, that's our opinion here at Reserve Advisors. But that preventative maintenance could also be a completely separate document. Either way, reserve studies should include that recommended preventative maintenance. With respect to structural inspections, again, another revision in the recent standards. Depending on where you live, you may already have a local ordinance in place that already requires some type of structural inspections. It could be a critical facade inspection. It could be concrete garage structures that require periodic inspections. City of Chicago steel fire escapes. It could be any of these structural components, and these new standards, they highlight the need to place on your radar screen these periodic structural inspections within your reserve study. So whether that be as an operating budget funded item or a reserve expenditure, they should be noted in your reserve study. The amount and the type of preventative maintenance, it's always been a significant impact. It's always had a significant impact on the remaining useful life of your components, and it's always been a consideration for firms like Reserve Advisors. But at times, extensive preventative maintenance can extend the actual useful life of a component beyond what we normally see. Some of your mechanical equipment, it either works or it doesn't work. A very timely, thorough preventative maintenance program may actually push that useful life out beyond its normal useful life. And I'd add flat roofing in there as well. A well-maintained roof system where they are on top of issues before they become major problems. Flat roof membranes can last a decent, sometimes longer than what we normally see, than what's considered the industry normal average useful life. But what really is impactful is when you conduct preventative maintenance that extends the useful life of a component beyond a low point in your community's cash flow. We build our cash flows towards those low points in your reserve balances. If you're able to do great maintenance, great preventative maintenance on a component where you move that useful life beyond that low point, you're in business. You're going to really help your cash flow. At times, that means we are able to include more stepped or phased or gradual increases in your reserve contribution to get to where you need to be. Now, there are some states that don't allow that. So depending on what state you're in, you might be out of luck there. But timely preventative maintenance maximizes that your remaining useful life or pushes stuff out. And that allows us to help you on the funding plan side at times. The flip side of that, though, is that limited preventative maintenance may also limit the amount of time an association has to accumulate funds for that project, as that actual useful life of the component is reduced, meaning you have less time to build your reserves or however you're going to pay for the project to take it on. So you don't want those remaining useful lives moving forward. That quite often creates a funding challenge. This is an incredibly basic example, and I want to note here that this does not consider the increased costs that Jack mentioned resulting from accelerated deterioration. This is simply an example noting the impact on the overall costs, life cycle costs, for when you end up reducing the useful life of a component. And the example shows that even a slight reduction in the useful life of a component can increase the overall cost. In this case, it's just 2 years of reduction in useful life, but it has a decent resulting increase in overall costs. And again, the concept here is that preventative maintenance maximizes the remaining useful life of your components. It keeps those projects out there as far as reasonably possible. Underfunded associations seem to have a tendency to cut preventative maintenance or limit reserve contribution increases, which then you have the issue of possibly reducing that useful life. We'll often see associations, they keep their annual contribution same for the number of years, or worse yet, they cut that contribution because every other operating budget line item is going up. I understand why, but it never really ends well. It's important to note that although a lot of this focus today has been on structural components, elevators, associations need to consider how structural maintenance fits in with all the other projects that an association must fund. In other words, just because you're doing a great job of the preventative maintenance on your structural components, that doesn't mean you can forget about things like chillers and pavement. So how that all fits together and understanding how that all fits together in your financial game plan within your reserve study is a key. And so with that, I appreciate everyone joining us here today. We will stay for a little bit to answer questions, even if we can't get to your question. And Jack, if you could go to the next slide, that would be great. Even if we can't get to your question, we'll send you a personal email, hopefully helping you out with that question.